So thank you very much for the invitation to allowing me to come to Athens from Sweden, particularly this time of the year. The weather is a little bit different there, so I am enjoying this immensely. Okay, we have a short time, so I go right to the matter here. I would like to state that I am not paid for this talk. And harm reduction, that is something that can be very controversial. But in some areas, it isn't controversial at all. I think, for example, when it's about to reduce death and disease from traffic, car collisions, segregating car and bikers in different lanes, we have no problem at all. With unhealthy food, we try to rid it of the toxicants, the saturated fats, etc. And for protecting fires, we have certain materials and certainly medicines. We want as few adverse events as possible. When we get to tattoos, alcohol, and underage and exmarital sex, it starts to be a little bit more controversial. But when we go to drugs, like illicit drugs, opium, heroin, amphetamine, and many new ones, and also tobacco, we have a lot of controversy. And for some reason, it seems to me that the controversy has to do with a continuum of necessity. If there is something necessary for our survival, as certainly food is, there is no discussion really about harm reduction. But when we get to drugs, and I'm not talking about medicines here, but drugs that drug addicts are using, there is, of course, nothing we need to survive. That's where the controversy starts to kick in. And I will come back to this in the very end of my talk. Despite the fact that we do not need drugs for survival, I think more or less every culture has its cultural drugs. And for us, it's certainly alcohol in various forms, beer, wine, hard liquor. It's caffeine, can be in soda, tea, coffee, nicotine. Nowadays we have clean nicotine formulations like gums and lozenges, patches. We have smokeless tobacco products, and we have the combustible products where cigarettes come in. And we also sometimes have drugs that are semi-accepted cultural. And I think cannabis and marijuana is a good example of that. And for some reason, I don't know if it just happens to be so or if they are causally related within the US. Smoking and tobacco is very much pressed down, stigmatized, and at the same time comes cannabis up, being legalized. So a little bit, at least time-wise, like communicating yours. For those of you who are not so knowledgeable into the pure substance of nicotine, I like to say that it's probably an ideal substance for harm reduction. People are smoking, and they smoke largely because of nicotine. It's not only for nicotine, but if not the nicotine was there, people would not smoke. And pure nicotine and even unburned nicotine or tobacco is not a big part of the problem, the health consequences. The harmful effects of nicotine we can find when the pregnant lady is smoking or taking any form of nicotine. Also the medicinal nicotine gum, for example, should not be used during pregnancy. It can also possibly increase the risk of type 2 diabetes, particularly in high consumers. And if one gets a myocardial infarction or a stroke, it increases the effect of it. It doesn't increase the risk of getting an MI or a stroke, but once you got it, it can be worse if you are a smoker or taking nicotine in any form. There are also some positive effects, but for the sake of time, I don't go into that. In the US, the FDA, Federal Food and Drug Department, have got control over tobacco since 2009. And the Commissioner, Director General of FDA, realizing that we have to solve this problem, and there are two ways they want to do it. One way is to reduce the nicotine content in cigarettes to such a low level that no one will have the desired pharmacological effects. And in that way, cigarettes would be obsolete. However, they are realizing if they only would do that, there would be a huge black market again, as it was with the prohibition of alcohol, and that would be a great source for organized crime. So, the commissioner said a year ago, nicotine, while highly addictive, is delivered through products on a continuum of risk, and that in order to successfully address cigarette addiction, we must make it possible for current smokers who still seek nicotine to get it from alternative and less harmful sources. Now I would like to give 4 examples of harm reduction in this field. And there are 4 countries, Sweden, Norway, Japan, and UK. And there are different products here. The product up there is a typical Swedish and Norwegian product. We call it snus. You put it under your upper lip. In Japan, they are now heat and burn, which is it's kind of small cigarettes that you put into a device, a large cigarette lighter, if you so want. And it warms up the product to around 200-300 degrees Celsius. So there is no burning. But this heat distills the nicotine out of the tobacco and some flavoring ingredients. And in the UK, there is the electronic cigarette I will give some examples from. So starting with Sweden. And the FDA, they can also say that some products are safer than other products. And in October this autumn, they gave such a license to the Swedish snus product, where they say that using General Snus instead of cigarette puts you at a lower risk of mouth cancer, heart disease, lung cancer, stroke, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. And that is the first time any health authority has kind of endorsed tobacco nicotine product. So in Sweden, we see the use of cigarettes, tobacco for cigarettes has gone down pretty much, and this is snus has gone up. So a little bit like communicating jars, cigarette goes down and snus use goes up. And this is the daily smokers, and you see all of the countries in the European Union here. And you also see Greece towards the right. I don't see very well myself here, but you see Sweden here, 5%, clearly an outlier to all the other countries. However, what is more important, that is the tobacco-related harm, death and disease. And here we have mortality from tobacco, and Sweden is, of course, lowest there. But if we would add snus, if we go back to this one, this is smoking. If we would add snus, Sweden would be on the same level as many other countries in the European Union. But we are very low when it comes to actually the lowest, the smoking-related mortality. So this is harm reduction, I would like to say. Norway is a neighboring country, that also can use snus because they don't belong to the European Union. You cannot do it in Greece. It's banned. Sweden got an exception when we joined the European Union. So it's a little strange. Cigarettes are fine, but snus is banned. In Norway, we also, this is the smoking prevalence of snus and smoking has gone down and is at pretty low levels now, and snus use has gone up. And in one particular age group, this is women, young women, we see that the smoking has gone down to almost zero. 1% of young Norwegian women are smoking, but many are using tobacco. They are using snus instead. And now I turn to United Kingdom, and there the product that has been in operation is the electronic cigarettes. And what I'm showing you here, that is smoking cessation activities over time, and the green line is e-cigarettes. Electronic cigarettes, fairly soon after introduction, became the most popular tool to help giving up smoking. However, because of the very bad press, more recently it has gone down. But it is still the most common way to stop smoking. And in this picture, we see that the introduction of electronic cigarettes that happened around 2017 there has accelerated the decline in prevalence of smoking. The criticism for certainly electronic cigarettes has been that it's a gateway. By that it's meaning young people, adolescents, they start with electronic cigarettes and they go on to smoking cigarettes. And if that were the case, that is really not good at all. But in this picture, we can see the prevalence of smoking among young adults 18 to 24 years age. And somewhere here where e-cigarettes came into fashion, we see that the downward trend has not increased, but rather accelerated. So from the sheer prevalence in the United Kingdom, it looks as the e-cigarettes are not a gateway, an introduction into cigarettes. And the public health in England, they are fairly or even strongly advocating e-cigarettes, coming out with several reports basically saying that e-cigarettes are far less harmful than cigarette smoking. And then a little bit from Japan. First, I'd like to say that cigarette sales in any country has usually been very stable. It's been an excellent business to be in. Addicted consumers, you know what the turnover will be for the next year and the profit. But in Japan, something really strange has happened. So this is the cigarette sales, and they started to go down. And if we look at this picture, which I don't see very well from here, but if we set cigarette sales to 100 at, 2015-16, it has dropped by 1/3. In a couple of 3 years, the cigarette sales have dropped by 1/3. And that is because we think from the introduction of 3 brands of heat but not burn. So this is, I mentioned a little earlier before, it's a small cigarette you put into this device and it warms up the tobacco so you can distill the nicotine and flavoring ingredients. This is showing about the same, so I skipped that. The examples that I've given here, should be of interest for those of you who are interested in economy, because this has happened without any interventions from the healthcare system. It is the capitalistic free market mechanisms, the introduction of new, less harmful products. And this has happened also despite that the health authorities really have not spoken the truth here. Many health authorities most actually say that e-cigarettes are as harmful as cigarettes and they should be forbidden. My governmental health bodies in Sweden has never endorsed that snus is less harmful than cigarettes. It seems to be extremely difficult to endorse something that can be positive for the tobacco companies, and I can understand that. But the problem is the population in the country, the smokers and the to-be smokers. Should we not speak the truth to save their health and life as well as much as possible? So in the brief talk here so far, I think it's fair to say that it's actually difficult to get rid of drugs. I mean, the US, was it President Nixon started a war on drugs? It hasn't been very successful. It has, and tobacco is because the substance nicotine per se doesn't seem to cause cancer or cardiovascular disease or respiratory symptoms, is probably ideal for harm reduction. And tobacco harm reduction can work. I've showed you 4 countries here as examples. And it can also happen without expensive interventions from taxpayers' money and the healthcare system. Now, is harm reduction good or bad? This is a fierce discussion, and people have such a strong view here. I think it comes down to, you would say harm reduction is needed, yes. If we think that we can, if we think that drugs are here to stay, and we won't get rid of all drugs, I think we must think of harm reduction as much as safer cars. We don't get rid of transportation, we want it. If we, however, think that we can get rid of drugs, harm reduction is not called for. It might even make the extinguishment of the drugs more difficult if there is a less harmful form of the drug. Then there will be less need to get rid of the drug. So I think that is the divider here, whether you believe that drugs are here to stay or we can get rid of all the drugs. And by that, I have come to the end of my short talk. Thank you very much.